Okay, so purchases, sales, we got the basics, basic business structure, a little bit on the litigation side. I kind of wanted to finish off, and I apologize if this is not your area of expertise, but you seem to know what you're talking about here. But what are the other sort of litigation or legal issues that someone could run into, specifically if they're buying rental properties, right? Is there, maybe not from an operational standpoint, but setting up the rental property, getting the financing in play? And if you could give some examples, if you have any, of things that could go wrong in all these processes from a legal perspective for a foreign national.
Sure. So there's probably two ways to look at that. There's what could happen before the closing occurs. So from signing that contract until the closing date, anything can go wrong in a typical closing process, just like whether or not it's an investment or a rental. And then after closing, you acquire this rental. In theory, there's an existing tenant in there, and then everything that could go wrong liability-wise. So before you close, you're going to have a contract presented to the seller. The seller signs it. You should know when you're writing that contract to present to the seller whether or not that's a tenant-occupied property. That's something that the seller would let you know. You would be buying it based on the rental income and make your decision. There's a provision in the contract that says this property is occupied and subject to a lease. You as the buyer have to honor that lease for the remainder of the lease term. So you should always get a copy of that lease, review that, make sure you're comfortable with the terms of that lease, because you're going to inherit that as a new owner, as the new landlord. So if you don't like the terms of that, whether it's the amount of money, whether it's some of the liability provisions, know that up front. Know that during your inspection period, because if you see that lease and you don't like how that's written, you shouldn't buy that property, or you should see if you can get an amendment to that lease by the seller, because he's the one who has liability or the ability to contract with the tenant. So you'll know going into that transaction, there's a tenant subject to this lease. I'm ultimately inheriting that lease. I have to honor it. And then, of course, when that lease comes up for renewal, you can decide if you want to renew it under new terms. But you are bound as the new owner under the remaining terms of that existing lease. So, of course, interviewing the tenant to know who's going to be living in this home that you now own is probably a good idea if you have the ability to do that. Even speaking with them on the phone to get a sense of who they may be, that's a good idea. Of course, getting insurance policies in place. Of course, that needs to be done if you're getting a loan. That's a mandatory factor. If you're buying cash, technically you don't need to buy property insurance, although that would be
crazy.
Very crazy, especially down here with the weather and the hurricanes that we get. But plenty of people roll the dice, especially maybe in the winter, and say, I'll get insurance in a few months and save $1. Not recommended, of course. But so there's that pre-closing. And once you sign on the dotted line, title transfers to you as the new owner. You're now a landlord. You're now a property manager. You're now somebody who's got some extra liability. You should certainly own that property in an LLC so that tenant doesn't slip and fall and break their neck and try to sue you personally. If you have it in an LLC, like we spoke about, you're protected in that regard. The company's the one liable, not you. What else is there? I guess there's always the typical risk of the tenant defaulting. If they don't pay that rent, they become a squatter. I think we were talking offline about that a little bit. What happens if that tenant just decides, I lost my job. I'm falling on some hard times. I can't afford to pay.
You missed it. Then we got to call Julian and security and.
Well, then we got to call the property manager.
Sheriff, They had the sheriff there. They shot the guy.
Well, let's try to avoid doing that if possible.
He lived only in the leg, but
I mean, with any investment, a rental property is an investment. With any investment, there's risk, and the risk for real estate investing is there's default risk, and that's the default of the tenant paying that monthly rent on time. So that's a very common scenario, and if you do have to ultimately evict that tenant, just like the litigation process for enforcing the contract, you have to, file a formal eviction, hire same thing, an attorney, a litigator who will file the proper paperwork to formally evict the tenant. And again, not necessarily the quickest process. And I'm not a litigator,
right?
But there are legal means to go through that process, and it's certainly not the fastest, and it's certainly not pleasant, but it happens all the time. So the more you know up front about the structure of the lease and the quality of the tenant, the more peace of mind you'll have going into the closing.
Perfect. So I have one final question. I just want to make sure I got everything for you. How common is it, outside of default or evicting a tenant, how common is it, and this obviously I'm asking you anecdotally, right? We're not pulling up any stats, but how common is it to get some sort of legal troubles or litigation from just the tenant, like, maybe like some sort of a fire or injury or is this a common thing here in Florida?
I have no stats behind that, but I would imagine so. I mean, I can just tell you off the top of my head, one of my best friends, my whole life, he's on his third tenant in his townhouse in a couple of years. The first tenant, broke his sliding glass door and certainly cost more than the security deposit to replace. Got in a fight with somebody in the property, punched a hole through the drywall, had to bring out a handyman to replace the drywall, stopped paying the rent. Of course, then he had to hire an attorney, like I spoke about, to get the tenant evicted. And of course, there's cost that gets incurred with all that. So it could be anything from weather-related stuff to fires, to floods, to violence in the property, to tenants not paying. All these things ultimately come down to, lost income, because
right.
you have to pay handyman to fix it. You have to release it. You have vacancy. You have monthly rent, because if you have a mortgage, that mortgage is still due whether or not that tenant's paying. So, I have no supporting stats, but I would say it comes down to the particular tenant, but I would say it's fairly common. I wouldn't want to spook a buyer to make it sound like don't buy rental property.
Right.
I have rental property myself, and I have very good tenants. I'm very fortunate, but if anything, it's luck of the draw.
Right. But in terms of the tenant suing the homeowner for some sort of negligence, or is that a common occurrence?
Similarly, I think that really depends on the condition of the property and the responsiveness of the landlord. The landlord has certain obligations under the lease. They have to keep the property habitable. It depends on what the lease says specifically. But of course, the landlord can't let, the power go out and the air conditioning break and a roof leak to go on for, 3 weeks without addressing it. So landlords have a duty of good faith, just like a tenant has to operate in good faith to keep the property habitable. And if you quickly address that and you remedy that, usually people are appreciative of a landlord responding. They understand things happen, things break, and landlords, as long as they quickly address these things, usually that can be resolved. But with anything, if a landlord is neglecting the property and not, fixing the things that they're liable to fix, a tenant might say, well, I'm not going to pay you. And now you get into that type of dispute where it's who's now responsible for what. And some of that is a matter of interpretation, but most of that is pretty spelled out pretty clearly in the typical standard Florida lease that we use.
Perfect. Okay. Well, you know what? You've covered everything that I wanted to cover. Obviously the basics. I don't want to get too in the weeds and technical here, but that was awesome. Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I think this was awesome. Hopefully it was informative. It's always great catching up with Vito.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Catching up with you. I would just like to say, I think I mentioned it before, if any of your clients, any Canadians out there looking to buy and invest in Florida, always happy to have an initial conversation to let them know that I'm happy to review the contract, explain the process, go into a little bit more depth with any of their specific circumstances or questions. And likewise, if you're selling property, certainly have an attorney review the contract, explain FERPTA, explain what your tax liability may be before you sign that contract, because once that seller signs the contract, there's no backing out.